Hello everyone, today we talk about the Kingdom of France between the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 13th century. Really big topic that we have strangely not addressed yet on Schwerpunkt. We discussed several occasions some medieval French topics, but never quite explored the Capetian dynasty and especially these first centuries that are very important for French and European history in general, because even though France was to rise during the 13th century as the most developed and most powerful monarchy in Europe, definitely the previous centuries had been very tough for the first of all from the Western Frankish and then the French monarchy. You know, basically at this time France was still called Kingdom of the Western Franks, just like Germany was called Kingdom of the Eastern Franks. It is for the first time under Philip II Augustus that we will see at the end of this video that we can talk about the French kingdom, the Kingdom of France, right? So the Royaume de France. So something that is very meaningful. It's more than just an institutional or political model. It's really something that transcends. There is a mystics of monarchy that definitely has in France its deeper roots. But these first centuries are very important because objectively the French monarchy could have been aborted at one point. We have been talking often about the fate of post-Carolingian kingdoms and observing that objectively the Western Frankish kingdom could have easily failed, just like the Italic or the Burgundian kingdom did. There was a time actually in which in Saint France the Burgundian kingdom had it better than the Western Frankish kingdom that was continuously torn apart by infight and so on. So, but France is also a bit the this great model, this great example. Let's say also how paradoxically the vassalic beneficiary system, in spite of its decentralization, is paradoxically a very strong gluing factor that is capable, in fact, of preserving the monarchic institution at one point and to expand it and to coagulate around it several communities and powers that will effectively at one point be integrated within the same profile of the kingdom. So this is really the picture from which we start, because if you look at the end of the 10th, with the rise of Yud Capet, or the beginning of the 11th, you see basically that the political situation of the French kingdom was characterized by a very accentuated fragmentation of power. This is something that had started in Western Francia very early, right? We have been talking about Charles the Bald. Very often we read some capitularies observing how since the 9th century basically things were falling apart as a great push, a great centrifugal and decentralizing push in this kingdom that was hit pretty hard, by the way, by the second invasions, especially by the Vikings, but fundamentally there were the Saracens in the south and the Hungars actually in France as well. So this definitely increased, together with the broader collapse of the Carolingian Empire, this greggational process that was particularly accentuated in here, essentially because France had been a bit the place from which effectively vassalic system had originated, from which these enormous clienteles that were fundamentally at the base of Frankish power had overdeveloped in a certain sense. As long as the Carolingian Empire had expanded, these were coagulated they were framed, let's say, under the political military guidance of the king, eventually emperor, during the Carolingian times. But at a certain point, when the empire overstretches and there is basically nothing else to conquer, you have a lot of private clienteles to which you have entrusted your public land, because there was no other way, by the way, to control it otherwise. And these clienteles start emancipating. They start to pursue their own political and military interests, in a condition in which the monarchic power, public authority, doesn't really have the means to cope with, simply because these clienteles had previously been the same means through which, as we have seen, the empire had been expanded, and now they were simply uncontrollable without the compensation of war spoils, let's say, and the thing was ending. And this was a real problem because the Western Frankish one was a pretty heavily militarized society in this vassalitic sense, in this clientelarly fashion. France at this point was probably still the wealthiest country in terms of really of absolute amount of resources, right? You know, these great Atlantic plains crossed by these major rivers are extremely fertile. France has throughout all the, even the ancient, but also naturally in the medieval and the modern and beyond eras, this enormous demographic and agricultural potential that in fact will make it rise in several parts in history. Take the 13th century, take the 16th century, take the 17th century, the second half at least, to this sometimes we can't call it kind of a hegemonic power, because it's a power that is able to extend also outside of its national, we can say, it's in the Latin sense of the word, borders. I'm not really a fan of the concept of hegemony, because at this point, we're not in the Victorian age. There is nothing like true hegemony, but there is an ability of projection that objectively in the French kingdom was amazing. As long as France was united, this was the real problem. Having a monarchy that could control all of these immense resources, because locally speaking, there were definitely communities that could use them on their own to resist this centralizing process of the monarchy and forming as powers on their own, right? Just to make a bit of a later example, when Machiavelli in the 16th century writes about the French kingdom, he observes that it was pretty damn difficult to control, because basically there were all these many powerful and very powerful vassals. Think about the Bourbon, were kind of a monarchy within the monarchy. But it was also pretty damn difficult to conquer, because all these dukes and barons and counts, they kind of tried to stem French power, but the monarchic power. But when invaded, obviously they had interests in common not to be invaded, and the opposite that Machiavelli represents is the Ottoman Empire that is centralized in the kind of Byzantine statal tradition that it had given it to itself. But once it's beheaded, when the main army is taken out, when the capital is conquered, you can control it very easily. Telling you the truth, by the 16th century, the French state was also one of the most powerful in a centralizing direction. But naturally, the process was for the construction of the modern state was yet to be developed. Then France bleeds out during the 16th century once again, in the second half, because of the wars of religion and all this stuff. So it's only under Louis XIV that it really re-expands, it consolidates, and becomes at that point maybe a bit of a kind of an hegemonic power, at least the overwhelming power in continental Europe, for which all the other European states basically have to ally themselves against, to contain. 13th century France, to which we will arrive today at the end, is something somewhat similar. And think about the branches of the Capetian dynasty, just like the Angevin one, for example, that occupied the county of Provence, the kingdom of Naples. They arrive to rule as dynasts in Hungary, in Poland. They extended, they have possessions in Greece, etc. So it's an enormous power that eventually, during the 14th century, kind of doesn't quite collapse, but basically gets brutally, let's say, resized, and France gets engulfed in the 100 Years' War. Like also international trade routes take another direction. But let's say by the 13th century, that today we will in fact not really analyze as such, because we will stop to Philip II, was really like the most, the greatest power ever. Like, at this point, the French kings, especially after the disgregation of the German monarchy, could, look at for example, the Holy Roman Emperors from the above, let's say, and they were those who were very far at the bottom at that point. So but as we were saying before, things had not always been that way, right? When you look at 11th century France, you find kind of a disastrous situation where you see that fundamentally there was no theological reason for which this monarchy had to take off, right? We've seen it with also those other monarchies, like the post-Carolingian kingdoms were pretty messed up in many ways. Like the Western Frankish, we're just discussing it now. The kingdom of Burgundy also kind of loses cohesion, gets fragmented, doesn't quite have a real king at one point. Same goes for the Italic kingdom. At the beginning of the 11th century, even stops electing their own monarchs. The Eastern Frankish kingdom, the German kingdom, is somewhat more functional in spite of its elective system, but it's kind of a power, and by the 11th to 12th century is rising objectively as the greatest power in Europe, while France quite slowly builds upon a model that we will observe now, and that is a strongly dynastic model. Right, you can rightfully say that, in fact, the Kingdom of France is not much of an institution in itself, even if there is this concept that there is a kind of a mystic body of the monarchy. That it's a concept that you find also in England, but it is very, very strong in France as well. But rather the concept of the dynasty, right? The idea that there is really a descendants, even if the monarch is theoretically still kind of a not really elective de facto, because that's not like the German one, for example. But even when Hugh Capet gets elected, in fact, it was elected. Like, there had to be a broader consensus of all the vassals of the kingdom. They were theoretically all the freemen of the kingdom by tradition, and at this point had been kind of surpassed and usurped, depending on which perspective you wanna take into this more seigneurial perspective, right? The French kingdom is the most highly verticized and stratified of the whole Christianity. The military, the political and military clientele, so the French kingdoms, are unmatched anywhere. That's the same reason for which the Frankish power had originated in the first place. It's this paradox, if you want, of this ultra-emphasized private character of power that is grounded very, very solidly since the very beginning by the same Franks, by the same Merovingians, by Clovis. We made several videos about Clovis and explaining how that effectively gave the rise to at least the premises for the French monarchy to evolve from that, because making a kind of a line from Clovis to the later French monarchy is a bit controversial. But objectively, even if you look at it from a geographical point of view, it's like the same system. It's this fundamentally today's northern French area north of the Loire and the Channel, that is the ancient Neustria, fundamentally, the ancient, would say, Western Francia, in fact, that was also one of the most Romanized. In fact, French is a Romance language. Areas where Frankish society transformed more rapidly, directed by the monarchy, right? The Clovis surpasses the Germanic ideal of the freemen that they had all to join willingly together, and he literally beheads all the other competitors to the Frankish rule, and he founds a dynasty that is properly the dynasty of Western Francia, of the Franks in that case, as a whole power that, by the way, was not really just a kingdom at that point, because the Franks have immediately this idea that they have to be an empire, and objectively France can be considered, in spite of the value of the monarchy that also, lexically speaking, has kind of taken over. French is the France is the monarchy, is the royaume, is the really the monarchy embodied, right? But objectively, it's a bit like of these kingdoms, like Hungary, also, for example, that they have a kind of a national core from which they expand around, and they start controlling several different other, even peoples, if you want. In the case of Hungary, it's kind of more, more evident for the more accentuated ethnic diversity of Central Europe and the Balkans. But with France, it's a bit more complicated, because at the point at which the Capetian dynasty develops, naturally, Gallo-Roman Germanic society has blended all together, right? It's mostly about those clienteles and those lineages, in fact, that make the difference, and that really embody the kingdom in practice, right? Because of their political power, military revenues, and so on. So, in this paradox, however, in theory, there could be also kind of a feudal anarchy remaining there, as there was in other areas of post-Carolingian world. At this point, however, for a reason or another that now we don't explain, because we are not making a prehistory of before the Capetians, but there is this idea that sticking around the monarchy is a kind of has a deeper meaning, right? Obviously there is a evident interest in terms of backing a public authority that can still bring some sort of order, of legitimization to some powers that are allies to it. This is particularly evident, in fact, even in the relation between the monarchy and the church, that is fundamental. And in fact, it had been founded in many ways since the time of Clovis. One of the Franks were one of the very few, actually the only Germanic peoples that didn't pass through Arianism. They converted to Catholicism from paganism straight away, because the alliance of the crown with the Gallo-Roman senatorial and episcopal elites was the key and the only mean probably to form that kind of model. And there is this idea of grandeur, in fact, of the monarchy as such. It's a kind of a sacral monarchy that, even if you look at the Frankish liturgy during the early Middle Ages, was developing a kind of a monarchical orientation. I mean, France has this idea that it's basically the center of Christianity, that there is a higher mission that the Franks had to substitute actually the same Roman authority in the West, right? Also by Byzantine delegation, because objectively Clovis had obtained the vicary of the Gauls back in the day by the Roman Emperor Zeno, and that there is a sort of broader alliance that becomes a mystical body. It's all together with a deep political and mystical and construction that we will observe a little bit better afterwards, that makes this monarchy surviving, right, in a way or another. And this is probably really a determining, if not a decisive factor, that in fact brought to the end of other post-Carolingian kingdoms, or that made them fail at the end, that made France, that was apparently the most fragmented, instead surviving, right? Because of this lack, in this case of France, of this pre-existing ideal of monarchy that had never quite died out, right? The Eastern Frankish lands had never had that. They were kind of still separated nations of Germans in a way or another. The Italic kingdom was also somewhat more of a grounded of a more kind of a there was kind of solid public authority, but in this sense in a with good public authority, but not a strict centralistic grip. That, however, also saw the lack of a certain powerful military clienteles because of the different redistribution of wealth. Like Italy was wealthier per capita, for example, than France, but in this sense, it had less clientele, had less social certification, for which, for example, they didn't have the same amount of heavy cavalry that this other kingdom had. You would say cavalry did have really an impact on the building of the monarchy. Well, maybe not directly, but the sense is that when you have large clienteles and society is already stratified, you can't start having this dialogue already at a higher sphere, right? You have so many scattered communities basically do all what they want, like also it's the case in Germany. Things are a bit different, and this is independent from the degree of public authority that exists civilly, conceptually, right? For example, Italy had a pretty good functioning kingdom back in the day. Germany hadn't, because there was not even a kingdom in there. France is in its degenerated and out of control expansion of military clienteles, paradoxically capable of producing a greater order. And one day I will have to do, today we stick to the Capetians, but one day I will have to do a video dedicated to, in fact, the major vassals of the French crown that at this point were, by the way, they were growing very powerful, sometimes even more powerful than the same French crown. And at that point, when you look at these blocks, you already see that there is a broader, let's say, level of territorial organization, and albeit being born from a completely private background of these vassals, it was still, kind of a, not really like small states, but something that could be brought together in one piece if, you had the guy at the top really wanting that, right? And just think in general think about the Dukes of Normandy that become kings of England, just for instance. So that's also a bit of the leitmotif in here of even in the emergence of the French monarchy in contrast with the English one. So when you look at France at the beginning of this period, you basically see the affirmation of several lesser seigneuries centered on the possession of castles, whose patrimony was constituted at expenses of the comital and ducal domain, right? Also naturally at the royal domain as well, right? The interesting thing of this is that this seigneuries had developed within the same territorial frames that had been, of the counties and of the duchies of Carolingian or even Merovingian times, right? So the concept is that there was theoretically some sort of public districtuation of the kingdom that gets overwhelmed by all this, expanding powers that do not truly follow those same patterns, but go beyond, get through them, and remodel also in many ways the various districtuations, right? It's really a matter of, at this point, not following the ancient order that also in part derived from Roman times in terms of the diocese, the county, etc., but creating a new administrative base, if you want, that will indirectly become part of the administration of the kingdom informally, on the base of private power. So this is feudalism in a nutshell. It's not about some sort of public ideal, but the private ideal that prevails. And this is there's something that you can find also in the in other kingdoms, and in France it's particularly accentuated, and that is very instructive in many ways, because it shows you how the failure of public authority was, let's say, compensated by the rise of properly feudal monarchies, right? So what before had been the the public power now was just a private power with some kind of public aura that was also loaded with this mystical ideals that was developing this in the same exact fashion that the other private vassals were doing, right? And this is something you can find also in this other Western monarchies from Britain to Iberia fundamentally, and that share in fact many analogies, many similarities. But this is feudal Europe at large in a nutshell, right? And as we were saying, naturally, the base of power were castles, land, and this broad military lifestyle that had formed, especially during the 10th century, Europe-wide, at least in post-Carolingian Europe-wide, this new class of noblemen that were primarily military men. They were knights, right? And they were starting to recognize themselves in a kind of substitutive fashion of public models. Like this class now was even developing what not really an international law, but there was this idea that if you were of a certain social status, if you had a certain kind of lifestyle, certain amount of wealth, you were part of the elite of the aristocrats, and you had this more or less legitimate justification for ruling, and much of this aristocracy would in fact evolve into most of also later Ancien Regime aristocracy that would survive in France and until the end of the French Revolution, and in certain cases also beyond, as this nobility of blood that really made the difference. It was the knight, right? Here the feudal society is dominated by the knight, right? And the king is just basically one knight that has a bit of more power, at least theoretically, because in practice, as we've seen, often has it even less than his own vassals, but that shares deeply at the root the same warlike ethics and chivalric lifestyle, that at least alleged chivalric. There's a lot of idealism into this, but that so a new power that emerges not from the public but from the private. This is very important, because this thing had gotten exasperated, in fact, in post-Carolingian times, but Frankish society and Western Frankish society especially had already had it since really late Roman times. It's something that dates back to the Roman latifundium that remains intact into gold. This had been an enormous difference, right? And it had made it possible throughout the centuries to form this vast military clienteles with just noblemen that very few people, let's say, that known an enormous amount of land, and that therefore could, among the other things, also afford the resources to train, to fight as professionals on horseback, on war horses, with armor, weapon, where you would think that at the time was like owning a private jet, right? And the rest of the people, the masses, being fundamentally subservient to them as peasants, as serfs, etc. So France is the true symbol of this order, and in fact, together with the monarchy, its own monarchy, the main promoter of what we think actually feudalism was during the Middle Ages, right? And especially in continental tradition, this is very strong. England, for example, came in many ways to be influenced by this model, but still, the English monarchy developed, so English society as a whole, in kind of a different way. So when British historiography took over in the West, we got also a lot of that perspective, but really feudalism proper is embodied by this French model that is really grounded in this kind of unmatched superiority of the elite over all the others, and this great sense of pride and prestige and power that really made these aristocrats feeling that they were legitimately kind of sort of chosen people. There is even a sort of proto-racial proto-racist even ideal. I mean, the idea that the peasant was kind of half human, like more of a beast, and instead the only true blood of a true warrior, true noble was something superior, right? And these are very strong concepts, because sometimes we overlook how deep was really also the contempt towards the socially inferior, towards those who, even for a French knight, even just fighting on foot was a shame. You were not basically a man if you fought on foot. You even deserved to die because you were worthless. So that's also, and there is a very dark picture overall. This was shared, of course, also in the rest of Europe, but the Frankish world had emanated this system, this model that, in spite of the dark sides, however, also catalyzed the process of revival and strengthening of the political authority in one way or another, and the ability of investing all these great capitals that the nobility evidently had, and triggering, in fact, the expansion and the revival of European economy, that in fact, not surprisingly, is so dramatically accelerated in the West, right? They were not the only side of the story, but they were also very, very important, especially in this area of Europe. The concept here is that the Capetians. So, what are the Capetians? Let's make a bit of an introduction. The Capetians is the dynasty that reigned actually in France, forever in post-Carolingian, after the Carolingians proper, because they ruled from 987 to effectively 1792, because in a way or another, all the other various French branches of, they descended from the Capetians, like the Valois, even the same Bourbon, and in fact they kept reigning also in after the Restoration between 1814 and 1848. So more properly, when we talk about the Capetians, we talk of the direct branch, in fact, that ruled between 987 and 1328, when the Valois come into power. As many noblemen of the time, we don't really know where they actually came from. They probably were originary of Neustria proper, so from Western Francia. And the family appears in history with Robert the Strong, for which, in fact, the Capetians are called, like, up to Hugh Capet, that gives the name to them, as the Robertingians, right? And Robert the Strong was actually a missus Dominicus of Charles the Bald, right? So they are very, very ancient in this sense. They had been part of that same Carolingian system at the beginning. He was a very powerful feudatory. He died in 866, and his son Eudes established the center of his own possessions into the Ile-de-France, where the Capetians would start, in fact, rising around Paris and making it effectively the center proper of France. Paris was already an important center during Carolingian times, but over time this was strengthened, and this branch, basically, this dynasty, defended effectively Paris from the Normans between 885 and 886. Eudes managed in 888 to be recognized as king, as his brother Robert in 922. But the son of the latter, Hug the Great, given the clashes that were tearing apart the kingdom, preferred to give the crown to Louis IV of Outremer, that was the son of Charles the Fair, to make of him kind of an instrument in his own hands, right? This thing of basically of a great kind of a prime minister, like the masters of palace had been entrusting, kind of a puppet monarchy to control things behind the scenes, was something Saint Carolingians had risen in that fashion. And the when Louis V died in 987, at this point it's when the kingdom was seized definitely by Hugh Capet, that was son of Hug the Great, and it was transmitted in a direct line to all the various Capetian kings. So Robert II, 996-1031, Henry I, 1031, 1060, Philip I, 1060, 1108, Louis VI, 1108, 1137, Louis VII, 1137, 1180, Philip II Augustus, 1180, 1223. That's where we stopped with today's video, but the list goes on with the Capetians, with Louis VIII, 1223, 1226, Louis IX, the Saint, one of the greatest monarchs in French history, 1226, 1270, Philip III, 1270, 1285, Philip IV the Fair, also another dramatically important king that we also discussed on Schwerpunkt, especially because of his clash with Boniface VIII, 1285, 1314, then Louis X, 1314, 1316, and his son John I, born posthumous, who lived only a few days afterwards. So he was succeeded then by his father's brothers, that were Philip V, who ruled between 1316 and 1322, and Charles IV between 1322 and 1328. And since Charles didn't have male sons, he was succeeded by his closer relative. According to the male line, it was Philip VI, son of Charles of Valois, brother of Philip IV. So you see how the Valois are basically Capetians, right? And giving then birth to the Valois branch that ruled between 1328 and 1498, from which, when you have the Louis XII at the end of the Middle Ages, that is the Valois-Orléans branch, were ruled between 1498 and 1515, and then with Francis I, the Valois-Angoulême branch, 1589, and then with Henry IV you have the Bourbon that become French kings, and that, but we are far away now in time in the modern age. So looking at these figures, Hug Capet, he was the founder proper of as we have seen, of what we call the Capetian dynasty proper. He was a son of Hug the Great, as we've seen. He was born in 941 and died in, at least we think, because it's not really sure. This is very ancient time, old time. Sometimes we don't even know when kings lived or died. He died probably around 996. And he rose to the throne pretty young, actually, 956, as Count, though, of Paris and Duke of the Franks. So in 965 he began to prevail at the court of Lothar, King of France, because he was not king, he just was this very powerful vassal, as we've seen. So when up to the point when he entered in contrast with Lothar, right? So when Lothar died eventually in 986, and also Lothar's son Louis 987, Hug was elected king at Noyon in 987, and eventually crowned at Reims, like the old tradition of the French kings. So with a bit of subtle means through which he managed to get rid of his rival Charles, was Duke of Lorraine. He also ensured for himself imperial support by renouncing to the claims on Lorraine. However, he had to eventually carry out other struggles, one against Eudes, that was Count of Chartres, and against Arnold, that was Archbishop of Reims. Reims was the most important ecclesiastical center for the legitimization of the French monarchy. We have seen that the same Charles had been crowned there, as was the tradition in French kingdom. And for this struggle against the church, he was threatened by Pope John the 15th. As a response, he called a synod of bishops at Chelles, where the bishops affirmed certain essentially hostile tendencies to papal power that had this Gallican character. That basically the Gallican Church is this is the French Church meant in autonomistic sense towards Rome, right? From a very ancient time, actually, it was revived in several times in history. But as we were saying before, the Western Frankish kingdom had been developing its own, and already the Frankish kingdom at the beginning of the Middle Ages had started having, for example, its own liturgy, its own relation with the monarchy, and being part of this greater system. So naturally, it was also very viable for the ecclesiastical lords who were trying to counter the expansion of the monarchy to side with the papacy for the extension, in fact, of papal power over the national church, while the monarchy would naturally push in the other direction. And in 987, Hug also had his son Robert consecrated, which ensured the hereditary succession at that point of his own family, and de facto founding the Capetian dynasty. So with the Capetians that at this point exercised sovereignty on this restricted areas of the domain of the Ile-de-France, so this region all around Paris, and from here, though, they managed to strengthen their power, to expand it beyond. This is a very fertile area. There are important resources, well connected. It's close to the Champagne fairs. There is this centrality, on the Seine. This traffics also with the channel. It's a very important land. So, in spite of the objective weakness of royal power at this point, the Capetians managed to maintain their own crown and to commit themselves both to rationalize the management of the considerable landed patrimony of the family, and to contain, through the creation of a solid net of feudal ties, the autonomistic tendencies of the small banal or castle seigneuries that were born within their own area of influence, right? So there is this progressive absorption, or elimination or cooptation, or of certain local powers that at this point also have sometimes a direct interest to join the monarchy in this process, but in other cases would be adverse to them. So founding this very solid bulk of power that starts exceeding the average, is just the local power, and building on many prerogatives, and many of which were, as we have seen, also increasingly supported at this point by the church, right? The church had always had, in spite of the various, the personal enmities and various conjunctions that could happen politically speaking, to back the monarchy, right? The idea is that the church has a weaker control on the succession of power because it's de facto a non-hereditary institution. So even though the ecclesiastical elites would definitely be part of broader, lay groups, of which the various elements of these families would become bishops, abbots, sometimes at very high level. There was still the idea that the church had its own sphere of competence that had to be protected from the aims of the laymen, that naturally at this point would try to expand also in ecclesiastical land. Hence, with also the spiritual weapons, admonishments, excommunications, and stuff like that. The church maintained the idea that that its own domain had to be protected, and the monarch was a perfect ally for this, because the monarch was fundamentally searching for an ally, an institutional and political ally that would stress, similarly to him, the prerogatives of certain, not really public in this sense, but of permanent power, right? It was not subject to private management, was a mere good or property, but that would live on in a kind of a long-term perspective, right? So this happened in similar ways also in Germany, in Italy, and it was a bit of a constant over time. Naturally, this doesn't mean that, of course, it wasn't ferocious attritions with the church. Part of the reason, by the way, part of the means, at least, through which the French monarchy managed to expand sometimes, especially in the northeast of the Ile-de-France as a direction, was to sometimes, especially in the following centuries, to back this or that city, these commoners, communities, when maybe a bishop had become too powerful and they wanted to counter it. So even in here, when there was enough, it was enough convenient, even the monarchy sided with the commoners that, as we've seen, they were considered like garbage on a regular basis in order to counter this or that power. So, and obviously, when the power of this or that aristocrat was enough resized, naturally the monarch would try to incorporate both of them, and expanding also on that community that had helped him. So this is normal business, normal administration, but it's obvious that when you have enough concentrated power, you can start to eat bit by bit, those various seigniories, because this situation is so fragmented that you can, in fact, take this piece or this other one without causing too much trouble, right? It's only on the longer run that someone finds out that you have become too powerful in the process of eating all of these smaller fishes, let's say, and that you're strengthening considerably. So what else can we say here? So to increase the force and prestige of the French monarchy, Capetian dynasty, was Louis VI, that, as we've seen, ruled between 1108 and 1137. Louis VI, known as the Fat, also was the son of Philip I, and he was born in 1081 and died in Paris in 1137, and he was associated to the government of his father in 1098. So naturally, this dynasty would try to perpetrate its own, even its own dynasty by preparing their sons to be king effectively. So this is particularly important, and this was a way naturally to strengthen also the legitimacy of the succession that, as we've seen, was not really automatic before, like it was something every noble craved for, but in according to the Carolingian legacy, this thing had been in part formalized, but still there was the need of a broader political support to achieve it. At this point, the monarchy was still depending on this swings, right? By the way, Philip I was the great-great-son of hug Capet. Yeah, so if you want to follow the dynasty a little bit, and in at this point, the Louis the Fat is remembered actually because he was a very energetic sovereign, right? And he managed to strengthen monarchical power, fighting against the other feudatories, and tying increasingly the clergy to the monarchy. Together also, however, with the urban communities that, as we have seen, were this precious tool to counter the most aggressive feudatories. This is a policy that was carried out similarly also in Germany to back, in fact, royal and imperial power. It was based on the granting of privileges or of city rights or market rights, so that these cities would also grow somewhat powerful. Their militias could participate to a royal call to the ban, and therefore, making its own their own impact in the political and military scenario. So Louis the Fat also carried out very fine action outside of the Capetian domains proper, and with this unifying aim, he led an expedition in Flanders, and he also obtained that the Count of Alsace, so actually a vassal of the German king, sworn him an oath as his own vassal instead. This is very important. Alsace was de facto a German land, but at this point the frontier between the western and the eastern Frankish kingdom was pretty blurred, right? And it was it was a very large space of ambiguity, of intersections, because this broader Lorraine also kind of failed as kind of a center of power. It was this broad area between France and Germany that didn't have a real center of power, so it was easy for the stronger monarchy to kind of starting interfering into these areas. So Louis the Fat then fought for the control of Normandy and against the King of England, Henry I, but he was defeated. And he managed instead, successfully, to repel in 1124 a new attempt of invasion of the Western Frankish kingdom, carried out by the emperor, the Germanic emperor Henry V, that was allied with the English king. It was very often this, kind of alliance of certain German elements with the English to try to wipe out French power, as we'll see better also later, the time of Philip II, or Louis VII now, as we will see. And he also expanded a bit toward the southeast, as he, in terms of spheres of influence, by marrying Adelaide, was the daughter of Humbert II, Count of Savoy, that was on the southern eastern border of the Alpine area, and this was a particularly important sovereign that also started to grow really the strength and prestige of the monarchy as a outside the traditional borders at this point, that where it had been confined into, and he was backed by this figure. There was Suger, abbot of Saint-Denis, and counselor of the king, who gave his own contribution by respecting in his ideological elaboration the superiority of royal function on the one of the other territorial lords. Now, the Abbey of Saint-Denis is properly the most important, is really the core of France, ideally meant. Always remember it, the French kingdom and France are Saint-Denis, and only and exclusively Saint-Denis. France is not Paris, even if Saint-Denis now, has been incorporated by Paris, urbanistically speaking, but it's not Notre Dame, it's not Rheims, it's not Chartres. France is Saint-Denis and exclusively Saint-Denis. And this was the royal necropolis since Merovingian times. The French crown was so devoted to this abbey that technically the French king was a vassal of the abbey of Saint-Denis proper. Obviously, it's kind of it was real, but it was largely a symbolical and mystical bond. Naturally, the monarchy was more powerful, but here is stamped really the devotion of the French king as the most Christian monarchs in Europe, and this very strong mission that goes beyond the mere lay power, but it's something that goes beyond. It's a ministerium of the church, right? As incidentally, we were talking about the other day about Louis the Pious and his capitulary Admonitio Generalis ad omnes regni ordines, that really makes you understand how deeply the also here the Carolingians had spread this idea of the sacrality of the monarchy, right? Kind of as an imperial one, and the Western Frankish kings really had collected this legacy very strongly. They felt themselves more than just kings; they were kind of emperors and Christian emperors, and it's a very, very deep and meaningful and leading and driving concept in the French monarchy. Suger is one of the most famous figures. Also started in history of art because of his contribution to the creation of the first Gothic cathedrals. So in Latin you find him called also Sweet Gerius, of Saint-Denis, etc. And he was he was really a product of the Western Frankish elite of this time, both as a clergyman but also as a historian, as a man of letters. He was a very educated man. He was born in 1081, probably either in Saint-Denis proper or in Argenteuil, and he died in Saint-Denis in 1151. He studied together with the future King of France, Louis VI himself, right? And he became in 1122 Abbot of Saint-Denis. He was a political counselor and diplomatic envoy of the same Louis VI, that we've seen how importantly was dealing with international affairs, and eventually also for the successor Louis VII that we'll be seeing in a while. He even was regent of the Western Frankish kingdom during the Second Crusade in 1146, when Louis VII left together with the Queen for Syria, and he died while he was preparing an expedition in the Holy Land himself. So Suger's name is tied in general to this rhetorical and courtly work that is the Vita Ludovici Grossi Regis, so the life of the King Louis the Fat. Here Grossus stands for corpulent, etc. It's very precious for the information that it contains. Suger also left a lot of lesser works. He also started a history of the young Louis VII that, however, is not completed. And Suger, in fact, is most famously remembered for the reconstruction, rebuilding of the same Saint-Denis, about which he also left us a description. And this is a very important document of his own culture, in terms of, for example, also of all the various paraphernalia, the precious objects with which he enriched the treasure of Saint-Denis, that was properly a royal treasure at this point, that is in part preserved at the Louvre today. Very important figures. that effectively made the history of the crown proper. These figures were making the first steps towards which what in the 13th century would have become the organic theoretical and juridical construction of the French monarchy. Right here, the premises were being found, and they were already based on a pre-existing ideology of kingship, of the monarchy, of the French monarchy proper. But in here, there was a real power that was being built upon it, and it was strengthening itself on the base of this legacy, right? So France, by the way, at this point, and Paris especially, starts being probably the center, for example, of theological studies that are directed also by the monarchical direction in terms of of adherence to the monarchical ideal, legitimization, right? So it was a way to support ideologically and politically the French crown in its greater construction. So this went along, for example, with certain very meaningful manifestations. For example, the spread of the legend of the healing power of the kings, the thaumaturgic kings, and the writing post-mortem of the sovereigns' biographies, like it was done for the saints, right? So here the French monarchy starts becoming something very peculiar that objectively other monarchies do not quite have at this time. The French, this is often told in those chapters when there is the comparison between southern French, let's say Occitanian, especially Aquitanian, with Eleanor of Aquitaine when she married Louis the Seventh, and the northern French, so properly French models of courtly life, etc., and ethics and values. That the French monarchy was very stern, was very concentrated on its own religiosity and its sacrality as a leading institution, right? So this was reflected also in the way these men lived and how they were educated and what kind of ritual was being formed around this monarchy, right? This other very important figure, as we've seen, is Louis VII. It's kind of famous, ruled between 1137 and 1180. He is also often sometimes called the jeune, the young. He rose to the throne after his father, and he added to his own domains Aquitaine, that was brought to him in dowry by his wife Eleanor, who was the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, William X. This was a very big thing. It was one of the most important marriages of the time. It changed history, not really forever, because eventually we'll see that Aquitaine, the same Eleanor, passed to the English. But this started, creating certain, in fact, interactions between the French monarchy and also other powers, and increasing their intervention in other affairs. In fact, the same Louis X wanted immediately to impose monarchical power both on his feudatories, the lay feudatories, and also on the ecclesiastical hierarchy. This brought once again the French monarchy in collision with the papacy at the time of Innocent II this time, and Louis VII also took this opportunity to obtain control, like other monarchs were doing at the time, to the crusading expeditions, right? Because we have made a video actually recently that talks incidentally exactly about this. that is, in fact, how the First Crusade was somewhat a spontaneous adherence of several free vassals, let's say, to the papal call, right? And as you know, most of Crusaders, the first Crusades were in fact French, or at least French vassals. The title of this video is Evolution of Holy War from the Call of God to the Regulated Crusade between the 11th and 13th century. So, during the Second Crusade, the First Crusade, no king really participated because either they were excommunicated, they were fighting with someone else, you know, all these usual problems. But it was very important in the mid-12th century at this point to really take control of these expeditions and taking away, in fact, power of the Crusaders' directions from the papacy proper, right? So Louis VII, with this loaded religious sense of duty, decided to take control of the crusade proper. There was this part of the reason the crusade eventually disastrously failed was also this in fact uncompromising attitude that existed between the French king and the Holy Roman Emperor, because the German king actually at this point were regarded themselves respectively as, you know, the leading sovereigns of Europe, and that, you know, obviously were in competition the one between the other. So part of this French-German enmity was seemingly one of the main reasons why the crusade eventually failed. In this, it was called as the Shame of Damascus as a reason. So it was a total failure. And imagine also the impact this had also for the monarchy at home. Like, you don't launch a crusade and it fails disastrously, and you can't come home as if nothing was. You know, this was a pretty heavy blow, and a lot of money and power were burnt, in one shot. So at this point, Louis VII also famously divorced from his wife, who instead married Henry Plantagenet, right, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, that became, as a consequence, Duke of Aquitaine and eventually King of England, right? So this was really the greatest, most important marriage in many ways, because basically at this point the English king came to control literally more land on the French soil than the same French monarch, right? Because they had England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and other lands, and at this point the situation was extremely messed up for the French monarchy, because they could be easily not really destroyed, as you know, but overthrown as a dynasty, right? And that which was eventually all what even the following fights between France and England were really about, which was a dynastic clash at the end of the day, for rising, you know, substituting one lineage on the throne of another, but not annihilating the throne. So this is also very important, because it already tells you that there was a sense that certain monarchies were going beyond the mere, private possession, were being recognized as functional and, you know, traditional and solid political and institutional actors, and that were much more profitable to be seized as such, rather than, you know, as other, you know, simple possessions. And at this point, Louis was directly threatened by the English king, and he allied that was allied with the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and managed to save himself with an alliance with Pope Alexander III. It was very important, because you realize that here there is an Anglo-German alliance once again, and the French start siding increasingly more often with the papacy. this was a trend that was already set since like forever, because even from Merovingian times, the Frankish kings had always had this very strong ties and contacts with Rome. At this point, especially with the rise of the German monarchy under the Hohenstaufen, the direct threat posed by the Plantagenets on the French soil brought the French monarchy to necessarily ask for the papacy, but also for the papal help, but also for the papacy to side at that point with a power was directly in contrast with Germany, at this point, against which, together with the Lombard League, was fighting, right? So this was an important axis that was formed that would remain for quite a very long time. Actually, things could change, but as you know, at one point during the 13th and 14th century, there is a strong alliance between the French monarchy and the papacy that will even bring to the shift of the seat of the Curia, of the papal Curia, to Avignon, right? So Louis VII can be interpreted definitely as a strengthener of the monarchical prestige, but his power were resized definitely with the failure of the Second Crusade and his divorce. And there was an attempt from the royal tribunal of France to confiscate the fiefs of the Plantagenets at that point, but the French crown still didn't have the force to make such condemnation executed, right? So after a few decades, the various international relations would have granted the son of Louis VII, Philip II, Augustus, to carry out the sentence properly, and Louis VII rather followed the policy started by his predecessor, by his father, by committing himself to rationalize the administration of the royal domain and continuing in the somewhat prudent but nonetheless effective policy of coordination of the feudal forces by asking for new services of homage to the dukes and the counts, even though, only for the lesser beneficia, right? So not really for the same ducal and comital title, but it was already something, right, to have this recognition. And this is important because it confirms the new solidity that the Capetians had reached, and how the dynasty began to extend its own range of influence, also, far beyond at this point his direct dominion, by interfering, for example, in name of the defense of peace and of the church in Burgundy, for example, in Bourgogne, and in the Champagne, even in the county of Toulouse, so in the far southwest, we say at the antipodes of France, right? So this is particularly important because monarchies at this point are not being based anymore just on military retinues, but they need to now start to administering and managing more effectively the lands that they already control. So an administration with new figures, with new accountants and bookkeepers, and the construction of castles. So the rationalizations of domains that were originally very heterogeneous, that now are, however, being managed with an increased um, similar system that facilitates the same task, and that starts building a permanent base of income, which was the real big problem. The same reason why back in the day the Carolingian dynasty had finished, because that power had always been based on the kind of the vassalic beneficiary system, devoid of any further centralization. At this point, you need something more. You need some fixed incomes coming from rents or from this feudal homages, and this recognition of titles were starting being bought, right, and from the crown. So in the process, also extending this broader net of relations that make the other vassals saying, okay, well, a strong monarchy may be a threat to our autonomy, but it still can provide us with the recognition of certain core rights on our lands that could be, challenged, could be contested by someone else. So this is how slowly the process starts. It's sometimes a very material base, like literally castles and land and castles, and that's fundamentally what these monarchies are really based on, also in terms of military retinues, military power, etc. Similar process, in fact, is taking place in Germany under Frederick Barbarossa, who incidentally is actually importing the French model into Germany. It was something that basically Germany had remained somewhat superficially feudalized in political institutions. So the French crown at this point is already, the French monarchy is much more advanced already at the time, is speeding fast from the within, right, and starting to project these powers beyond. So finally, we come to Philip II Augustus. That is this. Is debatably the second greatest king in French history. The first one, obviously, being Louis XIV. I think definitely the most important medieval French king. In fact, called Augustus for this reason, Philippe Auguste, who, as we've seen, was son of Louis VII and his other wife Adele of Champagne. Philip was born in Paris in 1165, and he died eventually in Montgassicourt in 1223. And Philip succeeded to his father in 1180, when Louis VII had died. So, and Philip continues, in fact, carries on the paternal policy of affirmation of royal power on the most powerful feudal families. He weakens eventually the houses of Champagne, Flanders, and Bourgogne, and he eventually turned to fight the same English kings that at this point were, as we've seen in France, one of the most powerful and also troublesome for the monarchy at least feudal dynasty. The struggle began with this coup of Philip at Issoudun, and was interrupted suddenly with the Peace of Châteauroux in June 1187, for which the kingdom, the King of England, Henry II, gave, ceded to France the territories of the Vermandois in exchange for the marriage of his own son, John, that would be eventually known as John Lackland, with Philip's daughter. So the struggle was resorted once again, and Henry II was defeated and died after having signed this very humiliating peace, the Treaty of Azerido, on July 6, 1189. And at this date, the Third Crusade was being prepared, and Philip, in fact, undertook it together with the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, was old at this time, as you know. He also would die during the Crusade, and Richard the Lionheart, Richard I of England, the brother of John. And so Philip embarked at Genoa. At this point, actually, the Crusades had switched to sea routes that were much more convenient than the land ones, which the First Crusade had started. And he arrived in St. John of Acre when the Christians had concentrated all their own efforts to take away the city from the Muslims, away from the Muslims. So they somewhat managed it after very hard struggle in 1191. So at this point, Philip came back to France, and by exploiting the absence of Richard Lionheart, that had been made prisoner in Austria, coming back on the way to England, he attacked the English territories in Normandy by continuing also the war, also after the liberation of Richard, and eventually after his death against the successor John Lackland. And this was a terrible war, really, that was really wearing out the same French and English resources. These conflicts were starting being really terrible. During the 13th century, there's somewhat the full maturation of feudal warfare, and at the same time the development of other things like crossbows and trebuchets and so on. And these are all things that cost a lot, for which kingdoms have at this point are really developing mostly this organizational capabilities, can bring them to field these troops and resources on a prolonged base that is not just the traditionally seasonal one, but it's really kind of a wide and very ravaging war that wears out, really, as we've seen, all the resources. And this is kind of interesting because the way Philip manages this war is really exemplar. At the same time, in the same years, the Albigensian Crusade was being launched, and Philip. So this was launched, as you know, we haven't, I think, ever been talking in detail about the Albigensian Crusade and Schwerpunkt, but there were many interests that were far beyond the accusations of heresy of all these Occitan communities. Essentially, the French were pretty interested at this point in southern France, and especially in the county of Toulouse, that was pretty rich and powerful, and they wanted to absorb it also for seizing this position on the Mediterranean, because at this point the French monarchy didn't have effectively an access to the Mediterranean with the Crusades and all the trade that was developing in there. They needed it as a first-class power. So Philip, for the sake of the centralization of the monarchy, and does something very clever. He basically sends all the various French vassals to the Albigensian Crusade, right? So he basically gets rid of them, because these are still very, insubordinate. They do what they want. They still somewhat challenge the leadership of the crown. So they're not really reliable. And he sends them to die during the Albigensian Crusade. Is one of the bloodiest affairs that eventually is reversed. Basically, as you know, the Crusaders managed to conquer everything. Then Simon de Montfort dies, and the county of Toulouse takes back everything. So it's very ugly business that you may wanna be carried out by your rivals that are gonna bleed in the process. While Philip instead used mercenaries, so salaried military professionals, to fight against the English in northern France, right? So troops that at this point are faithful to the crown simply because the crown pays them, and you'd say, well, so they were not so faithful. Well, actually not, because aside from what the 19th century romantic stereotype tells us mercenaries are pretty damn faithful and they're pretty damn effective as soldiers, because at the end of the day, that's, everybody fights in a way or another for something that be quantified economically speaking, as we've seen. Those French vassals weren't any better, on the contrary. So this is a very clever move that allows Philip to play on different strategic theaters at the same time, and to maintain, however, this very delicate balance that can make the Capetians crumble from a moment to another. And at one point, in fact, the same French feudatories revolt, right? And that's why also he sent them fundamentally to this new enterprise in the south. And however, he managed, with several victories, step after step, to a very heavy blow to English power in France by occupying Normandy, Bretagne, Poitou, Aquitaine, right? So really conquering all of those territories that had been in control of the Angevins after they had risen to the English throne, and this was done in spite of the support that Pope Innocent III, that was the most powerful pope in all history at this point, was really controlling the policy of all Europe, to the English in 1208. So in 1213, Philip even tried, although failing, to bring war on the same English soil. Consequently, he also backed Frederick II of Hohenstaufen in his conquest of imperial power against Otto of Brunswick. We made several videos on this very important moment in history. I can give you maybe the titles later, but as you know, this was a very important crossroad, probably the most important crossroad in medieval European history, as there was this alliance, this axis now of the the Hohenstaufen had been dispossessed of the empire. Otto of Brunswick had been elected. He was a Welfen, so he was opposed to the Hohenstaufen, and Frederick II was a minor. He, as king of Sicily, he fought against Otto of Brunswick, that had obtained his imperial title by the papacy through the promise. By the promise of not reuniting the kingdoms of Germany and Sicily. Instead, the first thing he did was to invade Sicily. So the papacy got pretty fed up of this, because the popes had struggled against the papacy, against the empire, as the Hohenstaufen had tried to reunite all of of Germany, Italy, and Sicily. So at this point, instead, it was Otto of Brunswick who was threatening to do the same thing. Otto, as a Welfen, was allied traditionally as from Saxony with the Kingdom of England, so he also in an anti-French fashion. So at this point, there's this new axis reformed with the papacy that backs the French crown in his struggle against the Anglo-Germans, basically, in support of the Hohenstaufen at this point. And in here, there is the most important battle in the world medieval history, and there is no discussion about this by any standard. No, it wasn't Poitiers. It was definitely Buvine, right? The Battle of Buvine is the most influential, the most it really changed the history of Western world forever, right? The Battle of Buvine, Philip manages to defeat the Anglo-German army and to basically wipe out both German and English power, and to take and secure once again basically all the English territory in France, and to make of France the most powerful monarchy in Europe, and to maintain it basically for more than a century as such. And the this is an event of enormous importance. It triggered, in fact, the rise to the throne of Frederick II, that managed to obtain the imperial title taken away from Otto of Brunswick. This brought Philip II, by the way, to extend royal power also on two other very powerful rebel feudatories, that were the Count of Flanders and the Count of Boulogne. So this was really the apex of Philip's power, that at this point wisely chose to consolidate the results already obtained by being supported by certain powers, especially the urban classes, the communes, against the vassals. Right, this was very important in the process of centralization of the French monarchy. Philip led the foundations, the most stable and solid foundations of the French monarchy. He also created this first kind of central offices, like the bailiffs and the senescalcs, and he had this ability, in fact, to start making the monarchy function with this degree of centralization was needed in order to collect taxes and to fuel various military expeditions, and in fact, were to rocket, especially under his own successors. There is also the Caesar of southern France. So at that point, really France rockets to the start, and everything really changed at Buvine. On the field of Buvine, the same king on that occasion officiated the mass. It was the battle was fought on Sunday, and he really embodied, the feudal ideal at the fullest. The Battle of Buvine was also a triumph of feudal tactics and cavalry, of course, and it sanctioned a vision of the world that we also identified with the most deeply medieval one, also in its universalism and in the triumph of, in fact, of the feudal elite in this institutionalized form, with a monarchy finally that is able to order it to order hierarchically speaking, according to naturally a divine model, and that is reflected also politically. And Philip maintained a substantially independent attitude towards the papacy, both of regarding, for example, his divorce with Ingeborg of Denmark, that he had married as second wife in 1193, and also relatively to English policy, right? And he also didn't quite, care about the complaints of episcopal power. Was lamenting the idea that monarchy was becoming too powerful, but still, the usual alliance between the monarchy and the church at this point was consolidated, and there weren't many other options, right? And Philip II really stands out as this very capable and wise politician that was also extremely tenacious in carrying out his plans, etc. So is this enormous figure that maybe on Schwerpunkt one day we will deal with the due space given his importance. So yeah, I think this is mostly where we can't stop. it's a very important story for all the West, because objectively, you know, the Battle of Buvine, for example, triggered things like the Magna Carta, incidentally, right? If the English crown had won at Buvine, England would have had a radically different history. Like, this would have been everything would have changed, right? So, and okay, so today I told a lot of things. I don't know how clear it was, but I hope naturally that we will be talking about medieval France more on this channel, and we will definitely dedicate at one point one video to the Battle of Buvine, one to Philip II, just as, and definitely also to Plantagenet, England, and also to maybe a what if of what, if the Battle of Buvine had been won by the other side, would have happened. So all things that we have necessarily to discuss at one point, and we can't do all at once. So that's why we're going step by step, and sometimes even stating the obvious at this point. But it's something we need to make a bit of order. The way we're shaping Schwerpunkt is by layers, right? Putting all this, pavement, and then building upon it. It's particularly important, all this kind of manualistic type of videos that eventually will pave the road for more in detail videos, right? And definitely what we've been talking about today is ridiculously concentrated, and these are topics you could make literally an entire lifetime of studies on. So yeah, sometimes it's embarrassing how much I concentrate in one thing, and people say, well, your videos are so long, hooray. Well, okay, but how can I talk about these topics and making it like a kind of a 30 minutes video? Like, this has to be much more than that, and this is already a very, very concise and superficial at the end of the day. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.